There's a story most people have heard at some point. If you drop a frog into boiling water, it jumps out immediately. But if you place it in cool water and slowly turn up the heat, the story goes, it stays. Whether or not that's literally true isn't really the point. The reason the story sticks is because it describes something people recognize, not in animals, but in themselves. Sudden change triggers resistance. Gradual change invites adjustment. When something shifts slowly enough, it doesn't register as a crisis. It registers as something to work around. Most people can point to things they're sure they would never tolerate, at least at first. There's usually a clear line, a reaction that feels firm, almost automatic, a sense of, no, not that. What's interesting isn't that people cross those lines, it's how rarely they notice it happening. Change, in these cases, doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself as a reversal or a decision. It shows up in small allowances, framed as temporary, made for practical reasons, and rarely examined too closely. What once felt unacceptable becomes explainable, then manageable, then familiar. And somewhere along the way, the original boundary fades, not because it was consciously abandoned, but because it was slowly adjusted around. Most people don't experience this as giving something up. They experience it as adapting. An adaptation, especially when it happens gradually, tends to feel reasonable in the moment. That's what makes this pattern so difficult to see from the inside. At the beginning, boundaries tend to be clear. They're often formed during moments of contrast, when something feels sharply wrong or out of alignment, or incompatible with how someone sees themselves. The reaction is immediate. The discomfort is noticeable. There's very little ambiguity. But clarity like that usually depends on contrast, and contrast fades over time. Once something becomes part of the environment, it stops standing out. It becomes the backdrop rather than the focal point. That's where adjustment begins. The first adjustments are usually small. They're framed as exceptions, as temporary compromises, as practical responses to circumstances. Nothing feels permanent yet. Language softens. Explanations become more nuanced. What once felt like a firm boundary starts to sound more like a preference. And because each adjustment is minor, it doesn't feel like a reversal. It feels like being reasonable. Over time, those small allowances accumulate, not all at once, not in a way that feels dramatic, just enough that the original line becomes harder to locate. People stop asking whether something is acceptable and start asking whether it's manageable. That shift matters, because once the question changes, the outcome usually does too. What was once evaluated against a standard becomes evaluated against endurance. Can I live with this? Can I make it work? Can I get used to it? Those questions don't sound like surrender. They sound like problem solving. And that's why the process rarely feels alarming while it's happening. As adjustment continues, normalization sets in. What once felt unusual becomes routine. What once prompted discussion becomes assumed. What once caused tension becomes background noise. The absence of reaction starts to feel like resolution, but it isn't. It's accommodation. And accommodation has a way of reinforcing itself. Once something becomes normal, resisting it feels disruptive. Questioning it feels unnecessary. Revisiting the original boundary feels abstract. People begin to forget not just what they once rejected, but why. Memory adjusts alongside behavior. Past discomfort is reinterpreted. Initial resistance is reframed as overreaction. The original line starts to feel less justified in hindsight. This is where identity quietly enters the picture. People don't just adapt to circumstances, they adapt their understanding of themselves. They become the kind of person who handles this situation, who tolerates this environment, who manages these conditions. That self-image provides continuity, and continuity feels stabilizing. Leaving, objecting, or redrawing boundaries doesn't just threaten the situation, it threatens that identity. It raises uncomfortable questions. If I once said this was unacceptable, and now I'm living with it, what does that say about me? If I acknowledge how far things have shifted, what am I supposed to do with that realization? Avoiding those questions is often easier than answering them, so the adjustment continues. This pattern isn't limited to personal circumstances. Organizations do this. Institutions do this. Entire systems do this. Standards erode gradually. Short-term fixes replace long-term solutions. Temporary measures become permanent structures. Each step makes sense in isolation, and because no single moment feels decisive, responsibility diffuses. There's no clear point to object to, because no single change appears significant enough on its own. By the time the overall shift becomes obvious, it's usually described as having happened slowly, then all at once. But the all at once part is usually just recognition catching up with reality. When people look back, they're often surprised by how much they accepted, not because they were passive or unaware, but because each step felt survivable. That's the quiet power of gradual change. It doesn't demand agreement. It only asks for tolerance. And tolerance, extended repeatedly, can move boundaries further than outright pressure ever could. By the time someone notices how far things have shifted, the conditions that once triggered resistance are long gone. What remains is a situation that feels stable, familiar, and difficult to challenge, even if it no longer aligns with what was once considered acceptable. This isn't a failure of character or intelligence. It's a reflection of how humans adapt to their environments. Gradual change bypasses alarm systems designed for sudden threats. It replaces clear decisions with ongoing adjustments. And because each adjustment feels reasonable in context, the overall trajectory is rarely questioned until much later. That's why stories like the one about the frog persist, not because they're precise, but because they capture something experiential. They describe how danger isn't always recognized in the moment. Sometimes it's only visible in retrospect, once the conditions have already changed, and the old boundaries no longer feel easy to return to.